Welcome to the Arts Lunch at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. I'm Jennifer Oz Freeman. I'm the Associate Professor and Program Director for Theology and the Arts at United, and we're very excited to have with us our esteemed alum, Max Brumberg-Kraus, who is also currently an MFA student at Goddard and will be speaking to us today about some of their recent work on Julian of Norwich. Max, welcome.
Thank you, Jennifer. Can everyone in Zoom hear me okay? Great. I'm just going to share my screen. I have a presentation. I promise there is a presentation. Really excited. Okay, great. So yeah, thank you for inviting me to Arts Lunch. I love this space and want to share a little bit of some of the art I've been doing since working at and being a student at United. So this presentation is called Three Gifts, Revelations from the Art of the Rosary. And it's about a project that developed in my second and third semesters at two related projects that developed in my second and third semesters at Goddard College. So what am I doing? What am I setting out to do? In this presentation, I'm going to explore how both practicing a daily rosary ritual and crafting rosaries have helped me have helped attune me to sacred presence in my day-to-day life and connect me, at least partially, across time and space to other lives. So thinking of this, the rosary and the ritual of the rosary as a kind of conduit. So my MFA research, this is part of my Master of Fine Arts research. This project is part of my overall exploration of visionary writing from the Middle Ages, hagiography, the lives of holy people, but especially the first person visionary accounts of people like Julian of Norwich, Hildegard of Bingen, Marguerite Porete, different medieval mystics. And the sort of central figure that has taken over most of my projects has been Julian of Norwich, who lived in the 1300s and early 1400s in Norwich, which was the second largest city in medieval England after London. So part of this exploration of Julian is that she had these visions that would become her book, The Revelations of Divine Love, which are read today by a wide range of different kinds of folks. But these visions that she had about the cosmos, about God, they all began with a crucifix. Possibly at the end of a rosary, although the rosary as we know it was being developed around this time, so it's hard to know if she would have had an exact something that looks like this. But she would have had a crucifix. What we know about people like her, she was what we call an anchorite, someone who was buried alive, so to speak. But what that really meant was she lived in a cell attached to a church for the majority of her life, where she was contemplating heaven, hell, the love of God, and praying on behalf of the community. It was this very particular societal job that she was doing at the time. A very important role that an entire life given to prayer. So we have rule books from this time, the most famous being the Anchoring Wis, Ulrid of Rievaulx, a little bit before the Anchoring Wis, which is written in Middle English, wrote a Latin rule book for how to live this kind of life, how to live as an anchoress or an anchorite. And what we know is that she would have said the same kinds of prayers for the most part that you say when you pray the rosary, Our Father, Hail Marys, various creeds, various, glory be, some of the prayers that I'll talk about a little bit later, but she would have said those, she would have had a crucifix. So there was, if not an exactly relationship to the rosary, she had the kind of pre-rosary, the proto-rosary would have been part of her day-to-day practice. So her visions begin this way, according to her own writing, that I consented to fix my eyes on the face of the crucifix if I could, and so I did. This is happening on what she believes to be her deathbed. She has this horrible illness. She cannot move her body. She is surrounded by a priest and a few other people who think this is her end. And the priest gives her this cross that she would have in her room. And again, she's saying, after this, as she looks on the crucifix, after this, my sight began to fail and all grew dark around me in the room, as though it had been night, except for the image of the cross in which I saw a light for all mankind. I did not know how. So her visions begin with this incredible encounter where she's looking at a cross, a crucifix, and everything around her disappears. Everything turns into shadow, and the crucifix, the figure on the crucifix begins to writhe, begins to bleed, begins to discolor in front of her. The world around her begins to dim. The body of Jesus on the crucifix begins to glow, and this transforms into 16 different visions that she experiences over a few days. But it all begins with a very strange encounter with a literal physical object. So the background of my own exploration of rosaries, of Julian, of the cross, how do I see the cross? So I'm not Christian, I am Jewish. I'm part of a lot of queer theological and religious groups, and generally am not like, growing up, the crucifix especially, but the cross in general was something that I saw as like really violent, really scary, kind of gross.
Yeah.
On one hand, and then also associated with, the KKK burning crosses, associated with sort of inquisition and conquering and conquest, just how frequently the cross has been used, on the shield of the Crusades, right? Like used to conquer the world. And as a Jewish person, how often the story of the Passion and the imagery of the Passion has been used specifically to instigate anti-Semitic violence throughout so much of Western history. So I'm coming to the cross with a lot of baggage, which I think most people come to the cross with a lot of baggage. I don't think the cross is a light, easy, go lucky image. And it wasn't for Julian. I mean, she sees this cross and she describes it in a way that is almost horrific. At this, I suddenly saw the red blood trickling down from under the crown of thorns, hot and fresh, plentiful and lifelike, just as though it were the moment in his passion when the crown of thorns was pressed onto his blessed head. Whoa, I mean, this is a pretty light description from her. All right, she goes into it a lot, and a lot of her visions are very much tied to this graphic bodily experience that she is seeing Jesus suffer through on the cross. So I don't know what to do with this as an artist, as a body affirming like artist and queer person. I'm just like, what is going on? And I decided if I was going to be working on these projects, because I find so much beautiful in Julian's writing. I think she has these beautiful ideas about what love is, how love sustains the world, how the cosmos runs. So I know she has that vision, she writes about that vision, and yet she's getting to that point from this image that I find so death-dealing and scary in so many ways. What is the connection? How does she go from one place to another? How do so many artists and so many theologians and so many people in the history go from this image of incredible suffering to this vision of love? Julian explains a little bit where she's coming from, and she presents something called these three gifts. This is something she brings up really early on in her book, in the first one or two chapters. She writes that these revelations were shown to a simple, uneducated creature in the year of our Lord, 1373, on the 8th day of May. So we're getting close to the anniversary. This person had already asked for 3 gifts by the grace of God. The first was to relive his passion in her mind. The second was bodily sickness. What a gift. The third was that God would give her 3 wounds. Okay. That is to say, the wound of true contrition, the wound of kind compassion, and the wound of purposeful longing for God. So Julian begins her contemplation, which, she first wrote a short version of her visions down and then spent at least 20 years writing the long version. So she spent at least 20 years or 30 years or 40 years or the rest of her life contemplating this vision and returning to these desires that first spurred the visions in the first place. This idea to actually bodily see and experience the pain that Jesus went through with him. To be pushed to the point of sickness because she has received all these stories of other mystics, other visionaries who encountered God in the midst of near-death experiences, in their frailty, in sickness. And then finally, these 3 wounds, this idea of true contrition, of feeling for and sorrow with Jesus, God, the wound of kind compassion, to participate in this compassion, and to long for God. Now, she's already doing some of these things when she's asking for it. She obviously longs for God if she's asking to long for God. She has some sort of sympathy for Jesus if she's asking for sympathy for Jesus. Like, some of it's already there, but she wants it to be kindled. She wants it to grow stronger. And so I took my lead from her when I began these projects. What are my 3 gifts? What are the things I'm wishing? What are the intentions I'm bringing? So the first one, the big, crucifix in the room, is to perceive something sacred in the cross. All right. I started this project not being able to, on a visceral, emotional level, see something as sacred in the cross. And I think that as an artist who does a lot of work with medieval visionary women, that is a holdup. I need to be able to empathize with them better if I'm going to be writing plays and poetry inspired by their writing and their lives. So I asked to perceive something sacred in the cross, this image that has been so used in such violent ways historically. I also wanted to experience the bodily reckoning in the presence of in the practice of the rosary. So I was not wishing for illness. I don't want more illness. I don't want more going on that extreme. I am no Julian, but I do want to move beyond this sort of a cerebral appreciation for the cross into something that really affects me on a visceral, physical level. And I wondered how doing this ritual might lead to something that is a kind of bodily reckoning, a bodily understanding, a bodily challenge. And then finally, I wanted to receive not 3 wounds. Again, I can be extreme. I'm not as extreme as Julian. I'm like, that's cool. I don't need wounds right now. I feel pretty wounded. But I'll take some touches, some gentle touch. And I wanted to be touched by Julian, that is to have a point of contact with Julian, to be touched by God or the cosmos, again, a point of contact with the cosmos, and touched by the art object itself, the thing that I'm looking at and the thing that eventually I would be making. So the first half of this project was called Do Touch the Art, and I will pass my first rosary around for those of us who are in the room, and I will just start by showing this fella here on camera. This rosary is made out of plastic, metal, and plastic, steel, and I believe steel wire, and some string because it was not made very well and I had to quickly fix some of it. And I shared this rosary with you because in August and September of 2022, I set out on an arts practice, an arts practicum, where I prayed a version of the rosary every morning for 6 days a week for 5 weeks. This is the rosary I was using. And it's pretty heavy it's not heavy, but it's, it's a big clunky rosary. It's it's quite large. And I like that visceral, how visceral that is. The beads also each have 4 engravings on each side. So that's also something tactile. So I would pray a version of the rosary, and I'll go into a little more detail what that looked like for me, because I'm not doing this as a Catholic, I'm doing this as someone who does not believe the Apostles' Creed, but who is still trying to connect in some kind of way, either religiously with this practice. Each day I'd write a journal entry about my experience afterwards. Usually of something in my bedroom, a painting, a poster, or a physical object like a statue or a religious object. I have a poster of jellyfish from Ernst Haeckel right above my bed. That became something I contemplated a lot. But the idea was to write these essays out of the art in my own life, out of religious objects in my own life after having prepared myself through reciting the rosary prayers. I very quickly also began to personalize what these prayers were and differentiate a little bit from doing this as someone who is practicing an art form versus a worshiper. I'm trying to respect that I'm not exactly doing this as a worshiper, at least not how I began. Don't know the rosary and how to pray the rosary. We begin with the sign of the cross, and then this is followed by saying the Apostles' Creed. I would say it in third person. I do not believe that Jesus is God, is my Lord and Savior, died, went down to hell. Those are not things that I believe. So I would say it as people believe, or some believe. I just felt like I don't want to pretend this creed. But my approach to the Our Fathers, Hail Marys, and Glory Bees is a little different, because those prayers are not written in first person the same way. They're written in second person. They're addressing people. My background is in theater, my background is in performance. So something about the dialogical nature versus the proclamation or proclaiming nature felt a little different to me. So saying Our Father, Hail Mary, Glory Be, etc., that became a kind of dialogue to the figures that are being that I'm praying to. And then when you pray, so you begin with, so after you say the Apostles' Creed, you do an Our Father, then you move to 3 Hail Mary beads, say each of those, another Our Father, and then you start contemplating the mysteries. These would traditionally be stories from the Gospels, stories from Jesus' life, and each day of the week they are there's a different sort of mood that you're praying towards or contemplating rather. So stories that are considered joyful are on, I believe, Mondays and Saturdays. Don't quote me on that. And then Tuesdays are sorrowful. Then Wednesday, glorious. Thursday, luminous. And they're all repeated except for Thursday, which gets its own special luminous day. I did not read scripture. I used poems. I was using poems that I would recite the whole poem through when I got to that point. Instead of contemplating the scripture, I was contemplating poems, really locating this as an artistic ritual rather than a primarily Christian ritual. At the same time, it was important to me to be working with poets and artists who had a connection to Catholicism, had a connection to the subject matter. Most of the poems I used were from John Donne, who the 16th and 17th century English poet who, even though he converted to Protestantism about halfway through his life, his theology, his poetry, his whole being was very much Catholic. He converted because it was illegal to be Catholic. And he wanted to marry a woman who was Protestant as well. and there was no way that would happen if he was Catholic, and also he didn't want to be killed, which is also a downer. So he became Protestant, but towards the end of his life, even his writing that is used in many sort of Protestant spaces has a deep relation to many medieval Catholic ideas about how matter works, about where the soul is, about where desire is, and was really inspired especially by relics and the whole tangibility of the whole human physical object. You see that throughout his poetry, including when he's writing love poetry. Like it's erotic love poetry is very religious poetry tends to be very erotic. So as to the prayers that I actually said, this is kind of what I call the first revelation I had during this project, is that the actual translation was really important. Maybe not that surprising, but the typical English translation of Our Father restructures the word order significantly from Latin. Now, Latin poetry, Latin grammar is such that every single word is either conjugated or declined so that the word tells you everything you need to know how it can relate to another word, which means that there isn't a need for sentence order, which also means that if you're a poet working in Latin, you can juxtapose different kinds of words and sounds, different meanings, images, and sounds in very particular ways. Besides thinking about, does this grammatically make sense? It does no matter what. So the poetry of Latin becomes very different when translated into English. The sentence structure of English is much more standardized than Latin. And so when I was saying this prayer every day, after a couple of days, after the third or fourth time, I was realizing that my brain was trying to like fill the blank and I would not memorize it well. I was saying, similar words. I was, my brain was adding words that made sense, but weren't the exact words of the typical English translation of the Lord's Prayer. So I retranslated it into English as close as I could to the Latin syntax. So I'll share just how differently those sound. And I want you to think about like, how does the way the words arise, how does it differ from my translation to the standard translation? So, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. This is the standard. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. And this is my version, paying attention to the very form of the prayer in Latin. Father of us, who is in heaven, may hallowed be the name of you. May come the kingdom of you. May be done the will of you. Bread, our daily portion, give to us today, and forgive us trespasses ours, as like we forgive the trespassers against us. And not us you lead into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. So, what happens for me when I started doing this, and I ended up doing this with Hail Mary, and a few of the other prayers, is that it felt like a more alien way of talking. It was less like the way I would normally speak English. And that made it easier for me to memorize because I had to know the exact form, and my brain was not going to just fill in a similar word. So by allowing a sort of foreignness or distance between myself and the prayer in this new translation, it became easier to memorize and made me more aware of the form. It also just surprised me, that the first word is father, not our, that the verbs tended to come before the you, may hallowed be. That there's this kind of dynamism, this action in the Latin that I found subtler in the English, in the standard English. And just that just discovering that kind of change and flow, again, made me really appreciate how the form of a prayer is part of the experience of it significantly. The second revelation is that these are dialogue, which I spoke about a little bit before. I'm talking, or it felt like I am talking to the Father, I'm talking to God. It felt so easy to start saying this and directing it, whether that was at my own like biological parents, whether that was at the idea of a father, whether it was that at God, but the actual way these poems are written felt so easy to go into in this kind of dialogical way where every word felt like there could be a response or there was a response. The poems also tended to be written, that many of the poems I selected from Donne tended to be addressing a lot of people. Usually he was addressing God or someone he was trying to sleep with. So not easy to tell always which one he is writing towards. But there was something about the dialogical nature of his poetry with the dialogical nature of the majority of the prayers. I mean, when you're saying the rosary, here's my little, thanks to Jennifer, here's my little Pope Francis rosary. When you're saying the rosary, I mean, this is 1 Our Father, 3 Hail Marys, 1 Our Father, 10 Hail Marys, glory be, Our Father, 10 Hail Marys. You know, you're saying over 50 prayers by the time. You're saying this a lot of times. And you know, the emotion behind each time you're saying it changes. Sometimes because you become aggravated, bored, sometimes because I am significantly moved, even to tears, by this meditation, these prayers that are about death and suffering and sin and how we hurt others and are hurt by others. Sometimes there's this longing that comes up. So repeating the same words 50 times is never doing the same thing 50 times. And that became really clear, and that's especially clear in the dialogical structure of these, which not only is putting something new from my own experience, but almost invites a new response, whether or not, whether it's visual or oral, some way that the world responds to me when I'm praying these different modes. So what are some of the other revelations I got from this? I mean, I talk about these next two as revelations of substance, of matter, of stuff. Those other two were revelations of form, how the actual poetry forms and ritual forms shape us. This is how the stuff affected me. I realized how alienated I had become from touch before, and especially since COVID. Right, there's this massive cultural reckoning that other people, other bodies, contact is dangerous, is something that is bad, and that love is creating distance between ourselves and others. And that was that's a hard way for a lot of us to live. Necessary, but it comes with a serious price. And it's just like another thing that came up is like that I have a lot of baggage hands with my experience of how my hands work. I'm dysgraphic. I had a long history in elementary school and middle school of like people assuming the abilities that I could do with what I could do with my hands said something about what I could do with my brain. And also the fact that my handwriting was poor and I couldn't write quickly seemed to be much more important than I could make art with my hands. And I believe that. I bought into that to a large extent. And so a big part of this ritual was reminding me of that pain and also transforming that pain. And it helped me be attentive and feel strains in my relationships with humans and non-humans. One particular essay I wrote after doing the rosary was looking at my pet snake, Postelini, who at that time it had been a couple of weeks. I normally will handle him maybe twice a week or so. He has a upsettable stomach, so I'm not gonna handle him too often, but I like to keep that bond going. He gives him time to trust, gives him time to explore the world outside of his tank. When I wrote this reflection, it had been several weeks since I had handled him. And I could tell instantly that he had grown a little more anxious with me, had gone resistant, and doing this whole ritual that was so much about being in touch with things and people and other creatures really made me have to be like, oh, I need to not let this drop. Like, we have a relationship and I have a lot that I need to put in. Another thing was just that as I wrote each day, having gone through this ritual, I started to just become aware of how magical so much stuff is, so much stuff around me. And so this is one of the reflections from the 4th or 5th week of writing, of doing this ritual. And so, yeah, I mean, I have now like quite a large number of essays from doing this. And this one was from a piece called Solar Systems. Someone shaped dirt, wood, nuts, fur, hair, fish, rock into pigments and brushes, pencils, and paper. Conjured into human likeness, earth infiltrates the demarcated society of the human. The nude, that pinnacle of art and obsession with humanity, is more accurately akin to kitsune or tanuki, wild things taking the shape of men and women, and of genderqueer enticements. The song of a selkie, seal turned into human lover, is our attempt to make love to the ocean. Anthropomorphism is not anthropocentrism. It is how we mediate things that are too powerful for us to see, to know, to kiss and hug, so we can touch. We title the planets with the names of humanoid deities. Why? So they will dance with us and we with them. And so doing this dialogical prayer every day and then looking at these objects around me, these artworks around me, it became a very quick slip into that's the you, that's the other. You're responding through these different beautiful, intimate pieces. And that art can be, a way to filter the immensity of nature into something that we can have a more personal, intimate relationship with instead of being completely struck by the awesomeness of it. And lastly, for this section on Do Touch the Art, after doing this ritual, this was a poem I wrote towards the end, based a lot on my experience of, very specifically, this rosary, kind of poem I wrote for it, Res Sancti, which is a sacred thing in Latin. Fingers oil slick the figure, metal, flat arms, fondle, bone-kissed, past the face to pecs, slanted, size of the face, ribs, collectively, equal proportion, inverse of a paunch. The fabric cast at the hip, too large for whatever it covers, the legs, knees furthest from the cross, a vertex, stroke the shins, the feet crossing, the vertical beam. Interior, exterior, okay. Interior, exterior, a back exposed, not naked but unfinished, relief at the front, this the concave, impressed. Into Jesus, nails mine painted into his back, go to Basilius, strip him, name, bear his text, the font rubbed if not robbed, thumb struck, pointer touched, inscription twice inscribed, backflip front, an inch on the other side. Brush the message off as his nipples, abolished from rendering, have left the chest impeccable, untranslatable, transferring logos for form, no longer king, a thing. And so for me, that poem has a lot to do with my reorientation around what things are. Things emerge, things live, things are an encounter between myself and the other, and things are an event. Sacred stuff. This was my movement from praying the rosary to making rosaries. And I was encouraged to do this by my advisor in my third semester at my MFA to move from my more familiar modes of writing and talking to something that was more challenging to me, and that could deal with some of these same themes, but from a different medium. And I highly recommend that everyone do practicums like this in their lives. You know, it doesn't have to be so foreign that you're dealing with themes or ideas that you're not invested in, but how can you get at that from a different angle? So we had decided that for the next semester, I would create 3 rosaries minimum. And these would be a personal rosary, an interpersonal rosary, and what I call the cosmic rosary. And importantly, how each of these would develop. Yeah, personal, this interpersonal, and each of these would develop in response to various things that just kind of came up in life at this time. So the personal rosary had a lot to do with my own reckoning with having diabetes, with having to think about blood in a different way on a daily basis, and how the rosary involves thinking about blood in an interesting way on a daily basis, thinking about death, mortality. With the interpersonal, as I began work on my second rosary, our friend Danny Solis, a poet, died very suddenly. And I very quickly realized that I couldn't think about interpersonal reflections on life and death, on the sacred, without thinking about him at the time. So I'm gonna pass these around while I talk some of the rosaries I made. This is the interpersonal one, and I will be talking about what they're made out of. The cosmic one had the most to do with my research on Julian of Norwich. And that one went through a slightly different process that I'll go into, but it's based on a vision we have of the cosmos. So revelations from making these different things, form. I had to start thinking a lot as I listened to the form of these things. What are the size of the beads? How do I distinguish our fathers from Hail Marys? What are the colors, size, material? How easy is it to move from one bead to the next? Am I going to do this on a string, on a cord, make chains? What's the overall weight? What are the colors? Is it a cross or a crucifix that I will use?
Excuse me.
Another revelation is, what are the materials? Where the medievalist Carolyn Walker Bynum writes a lot in one of her more recent books to similar similitudes about what matter meant in the Middle Ages and what it meant in the early history of Catholicism. And she asked, where does supernatural power reside, and what conceptions of the material world condition what we might call religious presence? And that's exactly the kind of question that I ended up asking. What materials evoke this religious presence? What materials have presence that that are easily accessible to me, and what presences emerge through a new relationship with a substance? So the personal rosary, is made out of AccuCheck strips, so the blood checking equipment used in diabetic upkeep. And on it, you can even see there are, on the actual strips, there are droplets of blood. That's the actual symbol that's on them. I disinfected these, but these were used pieces, lances, and test strips. I used hot glue, very fancy materials. This is the first one I made. And if I ended up hating it, I didn't want to go all out on materials. The central bead here is a sweet dried plum. So I wanted to use something that was sugary, something that was edible as this kind of connecting piece, something that might eventually disintegrate, but is for the most part preserved and will last a long time. And so this central bead again became important. The Our Father beads are these skulls, and that plays into my understanding of the rosary as a kind of memento mori, a reminder of death. And so much art in the Middle Ages is this reminder of death and our mortality as something that is scary and that we're praying to be soothed, but also as something that unites us all as humans. The interpersonal rosary, which I made for my friend Danny Solis when he died, I had very little choices to make because who he was and what his life was ended up determining a lot of what I made. Danny's, one of his biggest projects and passions was related to the Day of the Dead. And he's a Chicano poet and lived in Rochester and would do the Day of the Dead Poet Slam where participants would dress up as famous dead poets and compete lightly, but perform the work of these dead poets as a way to honor them. And so I knew immediately, thank you, that I wanted to do something with the marigolds that are ubiquitous parts of the Day of the Dead. And so I hand painted these marigold beads. Danny also was a big nerd and collected some, I don't know, I'm guessing upward to about 1,000 action figures. And so I asked my dad to send me some of my own action figures, specifically Spawn action figures, which Danny had quite a lot of. I asked him to send them to me, and I made the Our Father beads. I painted them like the Day of the Dead figures, calaveras, and then they're made out of action figure heads that I drilled and turned into beads. And then the central bead that I made is a little jar, and what it has in it is Danny's daily ritual, which was a sugarless sweetener. He also had diabetes. So a sugarless sweetener, cinnamon, coffee, cocoa, and non-dairy milk. So I've got all of those elements and created this little relic for them. And then I made a very simple wooden cross as the cross. And this had to do with Danny's love for dogs and playing fetch with dogs and thinking this would be a great stick. That he would love to play fetch with his dog, also named Max. So many layers of meaning. Exactly. Oh, right. It was oat milk, so there's oats in there. That's what it was. And yeah, and just like this mixture of things that I could just find out in the environment and things that are super artificial, but either way, they have memory, they have relationship. And this is important when I talk about my delightful semi-failure of my initial attempt at a cosmic rosary. I'm just gonna pass a couple of these beads. So my initial idea was to make my own hazelnut beads. And I was going to do it, and I did it out of resin. And part of my practicum was to work with different local artists I knew and to learn new techniques. One of them was hook loop sort of jewelry making, and then one was pouring resin and sculpting, making my molds. Molds. Oh, and the chemicals. They're all safe. So these are molds I made from real hazelnuts, and I was going to make this whole thing, which is based on Julian's vision of the world as all that is creation. She has this vision of all of that as a hazelnut in her hand. So I tried all these different mixes of colors and all these things, and By the end of the semester, I realized I hated working with resin.
Oh, good to know.
And I think there are some really cool possibilities with resin. I think that, future, there might be something really great working with it, but creating a full bead, creating something that would mostly be resin, really felt hollow to me. Literally, I mean, it's so light, and that's part of why I'm sharing these, is like the actual substance is so alien. What is, this is artificial resin. This is not resin from a tree,
Yeah.
from a flower. This is the synthetic material, and the action figures, also synthetic material. And yet those were things that I grew up with playing and were endowed with relationship and were designed by someone in this very different way than this kind of liquid plastic. And at the end of the semester, I was like, I could not make the Cosmic Rosary. This was everything I was working with felt so detached and removed from my experience. If I was doing a project about listening to materials, I was listening to this material and they were saying, no.
Good.
But I did return to it. I did return over the next semester and I created a very different kind of rosary. And I'll pass this one around. This is my Cosmic Rosary. And I probably spent the most time making this one. And learned some extra techniques. And this rosary is all based on Julian's vision again. And I was paying incredible attention to materials that she would have known, she would have used, materials that also made sense to me, and materials that connected me to the symbolically and physically to the cosmos. So this is made out of hazelnuts and wood and copper and egg yolks and natural pigments like iron oxide. I have iron oxide. I just think it's a really beautiful color. So I wanted to bring that. I didn't bring any eggs, but many of you are probably familiar with eggs. And turmeric was the other pigment I used a lot of. Balsa wood is what I carved out of. Gold leaf, which I learned how much I hate working with, but hope to return to. So I can master gold leaf instead of it mastering me. Parchment, animal skin. Black walnut. This is from the tree outside of our yard. And the tree that I saw through my window every day while praying this rosary. There are also plastic beads. I still ended up using plastic, but I used it to ornament and to accompany rather than to be the main substance. The plastic beads that are on the central walnut bead. And I used sealant because egg tempera pigments can, especially in a 3D form, can really shed. So I used a lot of sealant and glaze. And then I worked a lot on the cross, which I actually call a crucifix. And I call it a crucifix because to me, there is a representation of Jesus on the cross. I have a side wound, which is a motif that, transcends the medieval, but was all over the place in medieval Europe and medieval devotion to Jesus as this image of death and pain, and also this womb-like image of rebirth. And so I start with this gold-lined wound, and it's on parchment, it's on sheepskin, which is the sort of thing that Julian would have written on, or depending if she wrote it herself or spoke it and someone transcribed it, but it would have been written on parchment. And it's a quote from, it's a quote from this incredible moment where Julian asks to see hell. She has had most of her visions by this point of God's love, and the greatest sorrow is distance from God, that sin is distance from God, not necessarily doing this or this evil thing, but that removal, that distance, that alienation from God is the worst thing ever, worse even than torture and hell and death. And towards the end of her visions of seeing all this love and all this connection and all of the magic and majesty of Jesus and Mary, she asks to see hell, and she does not get that vision. Now she's very quick to be like, hey, just because I didn't see it doesn't mean we should just ignore all this church teaching, but also I didn't see it, just, I saw everything, but I didn't see hell, so do what you will.
You do them.
And she says, how come, how can it be that there's this doctrine and also that you love? She asked God, how can there be this doctrine? And how can you also love everyone? And how can the whole of creation be sustained by love if there's this horrible hell place? And the response she gets from the voice of God, again, not a vision, she does not see hell, but she hears a voice that says, that is impossible to thee is not impossible to me. And so she gets this vision of a God that is almost that transcends the doctrine, even if she cannot exactly say that, and maybe would not necessarily believe that, but there's a tension in her text between what she sees and what the doctrine is and what she hears from God. And I wanted to capture that in this wound. The quote of seeing the cosmos, okay, yeah, for a second I was like, did I do it in Middle English? So this is the quote where she receives a vision of the hazelnut. And in this he showed me a little thing, the quantity of a hazelnut, lying in the palm of my hand. It seemed that it was as round as any ball. I looked thereupon with the eye of my understanding, and I thought, what may this be? And it was answered generally thus, it is all that is made. I wondered how it could last, for I thought it might suddenly fall to nothing for little cause. And I was answered in my understanding. It lasts and ever shall, for God loves it. And so everything has its beginning by the love of God. In this little thing, I saw three properties. The first is that God made it. The second is that God loves it. And the third is that God keeps it. And later on in some of her writing, those different states also really are reflected in the persons of the Trinity. The maker as the sort of father, Jesus as sort of who loves, and the spirit that keeps it going, that sustains the world. I won't go, I won't read all this, but I just included in this presentation my artist statement about the rosary, but I pretty much have covered that in talking today. The overall revelations for making all three of these, I spoke a little bit about it as the rosary as a memento mori, a reminder of that we will die. So through this process of remembering death, and mortality became a central thematic focus of my whole 5 weeks doing this, despite not beginning with too much of a central theme. I did not start this with this was not the 2 month theme. This was the whole year of working on praying and then also sculpting, creating rosaries. I didn't go into shaping these with a clear theme. I was very much like, the material will lead me. But the personal kind of showed, a way to think about death and health and the vitality of blood in my own life. The interpersonal rosary had me thinking about death and remembrance, tribute, evoking memories of a dead friend and those kind of experiences. And then the cosmic one is these cycles of death and birth and how the world is intertwined with new beginnings and death even as a new beginning. So going back to my 3 gifts that I asked for, to perceive the sacred in the cross, to experience a bodily reckoning, to receive 3 touches, touched by Julian, a contact with Julian, a contact with God, or Cosmos, in contact with the art. So did I receive them? Yes, I did receive the first one to an extent. Aspects of the cross are still uncomfortable, and I think that's okay. It has been used in horrible ways, and contains so much. I mean, it started off as a tool of execution. So I don't think there's anything wrong with being uncomfortable with the cross, but I appreciate it now as something other than just its most horrific version. It is also a memento mori. It is also an art object. It is also a site of divine encounter. And it is an agent that can work through me as I figure out what the process of making something is. Did I experience a bodily reckoning? Absolutely. Praying the rosary revealed comforts and discomforts. how words feel in my mouth, charged vision, a reevaluation of touch, rebuilding self-love, through working with my hands, so many things I learned about my body and the bodies of others. How to know when my snake is comfortable and uncomfortable. I felt my fingers tense and cramp, but I also saw them caress and stroke while doing the rosary, while praying the rosary and while making rosaries. I could be delicate with a brush, a wire, or a knife, even if I felt I was clumsy beforehand. And did I receive these 3 touches? Yes. Overall, despite on its face being a mostly individual practice, the whole thing felt dialogical, transformative, and very communal, connecting with Julian across time, connecting with substance in the making, and connecting with connecting to the world through the substances of the thing, and then connecting to the art object through the forms it takes. So I will conclude my part here. That was a lot, and open up to questions and yeah, really any questions that anyone has. I'm gonna
So thank you, Max. Thanks for a great presentation, and thank you for everyone, and can continue the conversation here informally.